have trained 3 princes and 1 king. Not in writing, not in warfare, not in the ceremonial mathematics of who stands where and which hand receives which document at which precise angle. Other men handle those things. My work is smaller than all of that. My work is the pause. 3 seconds. That is the whole of it. 3 seconds between the question and the answer, regardless of the question, regardless of the answer, regardless of whether the question is about foreign policy or whether you prefer tea to coffee. 3 seconds, full stop, every time. I came to this work in 1987, assigned first to the household of a senior courtier whose name I am not at liberty to use, and who taught me the foundational truth of royal survival in 1 sentence, delivered over a plate of cold lamb at a working lunch that I have never forgotten. He said, "Gerald, the mouth is the only part of a royal that the press can quote directly." He said nothing else. He picked up his fork. Lunch continued. I have built my entire professional life on that sentence. My name is Gerald Fenn. I am 61 years old. I retired from active service in the royal household 14 months ago after 34 years, and I have been asked, by a journalist whose discretion I trust more than most, and whose persistence I trust absolutely, to write down the account of one particular afternoon in South Wales, in a primary school gymnasium that smelled of floor polish and old plimsolls, where a 7-year-old girl named Poppy dismantled 34 years of my finest work in approximately 11 seconds. I will get to Poppy. First, you need to understand the system. The pause is not hesitation. I want to be very clear about that. Hesitation is a tell. Hesitation signals that you are searching for the correct answer, which implies there is a correct answer, which implies there is also an incorrect one, and the press will spend the next 4 days trying to find it. The pause is something else entirely. The pause is a controlled respiratory event. 3 seconds during which the speaker does 4 things in precise sequence. He breathes in through the nose, he locates the emotional center of the question being asked. He determines whether that emotional center is a trap, and he selects his entry point into the answer. All of this in 3 seconds. In training, it takes 18 months to compress the sequence to that duration. Some never manage it. Those ones go into different roles. I have a notebook, small black moleskine, the cheap ones, not the expensive ones, because expensive notebooks in royal households get noticed, and noticed things get talked about, and talked about things end up in the wrong columns of the wrong newspapers. In this notebook, I make a small mark every time my principal executes the pause correctly. A tick, nothing more. At the end of a public engagement, I count the ticks. 30 ticks on a difficult day is a very good day. 40 is exceptional. 50 means we are in a controlled environment, and the press pool has been pre-briefed, and everyone is being professionally polite, which tells you nothing useful about your principal's actual readiness. I began working directly with William in 2001. He was 19. His mother had been dead for 4 years. He had the eyes of someone who had learned very early that the world would watch him grieve, and so he had decided, at some cellular level I could not access and he could not articulate, that the world would simply not be given the opportunity. He was already pausing when I met him. Not correctly, but already. You need to understand what the pause is built to prevent. I will not name names where names are not necessary, but I will tell you that in 34 years I witnessed, at close range, what happens when a royal trusts their own mouth without the mechanism in place. I watched it happen with one senior member in a television interview in 1995. I watched it happen with another in a different interview in 2019. I watched it happen in smaller, less televised ways at garden parties and charity galas, and on one memorable occasion at a walking tour of a biscuit factory in Staffordshire, where an unguarded comment about the caloric content of a chocolate digestive ended up in 14 newspapers across 3 countries. The mouth is the only part of a royal that the press can quote directly. Everything else, the expression, the posture, the quality of attention they extend to a veteran shaking their hand. These things can be photographed and interpreted and argued about. But words in quotation marks are definitive. Words in quotation marks sit in an archive forever. Words in quotation marks, spoken without the pause, without the 3-second sequence of breath, locate, determine, select, are the thing that ends careers and fractures households and gives your enemies material they will still be using 15 years after you thought the moment had safely passed. Diana did not have the pause. I say this not as criticism. I say it as diagnosis. She had something better than the pause. She had instinct so genuine and so overwhelming that it operated as its own kind of protection. Because a person whose warmth is entirely authentic generates a particular type of public love that is nearly impervious to manipulation. But instinct of that quality is not teachable and not transferable, and when it is gone, it is gone. And what you are left with is a royal family full of people who learned from watching her that authenticity was possible, without inheriting the specific quality of her authenticity that made it safe. William learned from watching his mother. He also learned from watching everything that came after. By the time he arrived in my formal care, in the summer of 2001, in a small meeting room on the second floor of St. James's Palace, with a view of the park and a tray of biscuits neither of us touched, he had already developed a version of the pause on his own. Intuitive, incomplete. The breathing was wrong, and he was locating the emotional center of questions too slowly, spending a full 5 seconds instead of 3, which in a press scrum reads not as composure but as evasion. But the instinct for the mechanism was there. My job was to finish what grief and experience had already started. Part 3, William at 19. He came into that first meeting the way very tall young men who have been told all their lives to watch their posture come into rooms, with a kind of aggressive correctness, chin slightly high, shoulders set, the whole body announcing that it was prepared to be evaluated and was not particularly interested in the result of the evaluation. He sat down. He looked at the biscuits. He did not take one. He looked at me. I said, "Sir, someone is going to ask you today or tomorrow or the day after whether you are happy. How do you answer?" 3 seconds of silence. "Then I'd say I'm doing well, thank you." I said, "How long did that take you?" He said, "I don't know, a few seconds." I said, 5. You took 5 seconds and you looked at the biscuits while you did it. The answer was fine. The 5 seconds and the biscuit look are the story. He looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following years. It was not hostility exactly. It was the look of a person who already knows something is true and is deciding whether to resent the person who said it aloud. He decided apparently not to. He said, "Show me." And so I did. The first 3 months were mechanics, breathing, the 4-step sequence. We drilled it on simple questions: favorite color, preferred holiday destination, thoughts on the weather, because the mechanism must become unconscious on simple questions before it can function under pressure on complex ones. The nervous system must metabolize the pause so completely that it no longer registers as behavior. It must become, as I told him, as natural as blinking. "What if I don't want to be natural?" he asked once, in about the 4th month, with the particular quality of frustration that comes not from failure but from relentless, grinding competence. He was executing the pause correctly by then. Every time. It was becoming, as I had promised, instinctive. "Then you'll want to be safe," I said, "and the pause is what safe looks like." He thought about that for 3 seconds exactly. I made a tick in my notebook. He noticed. He said nothing. But I could see, from the very slight shift of his expression, not quite a smile, something north of a grimace, that he had noticed the tick and understood what it meant, and had decided this was funny in a way he was not going to give me the satisfaction of acknowledging. That was the moment I knew he was going to be all right. I will walk you through what the pause actually does in a live environment. because the theory of it is nothing without the application. In 2003, at a public engagement in Edinburgh, a journalist, not part of the pre-approved press pool, standing near a barrier on the public side, called out a question about his mother's legacy. Personal, raw, designed, consciously or not, to produce a visible reaction that could be photographed. William heard the question. He breathed in through the nose. He located the emotional center, grief. Underneath that, anger. Underneath the anger, something more complicated that I could see moving across his face in the space of approximately 1 second, and that was gone by second 2. He determined trap. He selected his entry point. He said, she would have been very proud of everything Scotland has done for the people she cared so much about. The answer redirected without deflecting. It acknowledged the emotional territory without entering it. It ended on a subject other than himself. Total duration of pause, 3 seconds. The journalist got nothing usable. The photographers got a composed face. We moved on. I made a tick. In 2007, at a military function, a senior officer, not press, not an adversary, a genuinely well-meaning man asked William, in a semi-private moment at the edge of the room, how he was really doing. The word really is the most dangerous word in the English language when directed at a royal. Really is an invitation to abandon the mechanism. Really implies that the regular answer is insufficient and that the person asking deserves access to the thing underneath it. William heard the question. Breathed. Located. Genuine concern deployed carelessly. The emotional equivalent of handing someone a live grenade with a warm smile. Determined. Not a trap, but a door he could not open in this room at this event in front of these people. Selected warmth without entry. He said, better than I deserve, I think, with enough of a self-deprecating half-smile that the officer felt answered, and William had given away nothing that could be used, quoted, or remembered with any precision. Total duration, 3 seconds. I made a tick. By 2009, I was making 40 ticks on a regular engagement day. By 2012, the year of the Olympics, I was making 52 ticks on a difficult day in a difficult environment with 17 press bodies in the room. And William was executing the pause with such complete naturalness that 2 separate journalists wrote pieces about how remarkably authentic and unguarded he seemed. I read both pieces. I made 2 ticks in my notebook, sitting alone in my room at the hotel, for no reason that I could rationally explain. It was 2015 when I first saw it. William was at a private family event. I was present in a peripheral capacity, nearby, visible, not intrusive. It was a birthday gathering, one of the children, a garden afternoon light of the particular quality that English gardens produce in June that makes everything look briefly like a painting of itself. George was 3. He ran toward William from across the lawn with the committed full-body velocity of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned that running directly at things does not always produce the intended result. William saw him coming and paused. 1 second, maybe less, but I saw it, the breath, the fractional recalibration. And then he opened his arms and caught the boy and swung him up, and the moment was everything it should have been. Warm and real and photographically perfect, and nobody in that garden saw anything except a father catching his son. I saw the pause. I said nothing. I wrote nothing in my notebook. The notebook was in my jacket pocket and I did not reach for it. But I started watching more carefully after that. I watched him pause before responding when Charlotte, age 2, presented him with a drawing of what appeared to be either a horse or a building. I watched him pause at a private dinner when Kate asked him a question about his day. A simple question. The kind of question asked in every kitchen in England every evening, requiring no mechanism whatsoever. I watched him pause when a dog, a Labrador belonging to a member of staff at Anmer Hall, ran to him in the driveway, and he stood there for 1 full second, hand half extended, before completing the gesture. The dog licked his hand. William smiled. But the pause had been there. I drove back to London that evening with the particular feeling of a man who has built something very well and is only now beginning to understand the full cost of the construction. The pause was not just a professional mechanism anymore. It was the only way he knew how to meet the world. I had trained a man to protect himself so completely that the protection had become the self. The armor had not replaced the person, but the person had learned to live entirely inside the armor, and what he had lost, quietly and without drama, over 15 years of ticking notebooks and correct breathing and perfectly calibrated entry points, was the reflex to respond. Not the ability. The reflex. He could still respond without the pause. The capacity was there, but the nervous system no longer reached for it. The nervous system reached always and first for the mechanism. I thought about saying something. I said nothing. Because what do you say? You've been too good at this. The training worked too completely. You are now perfectly safe, and the safety is the problem. These are not things a protocol officer says to the Prince of Wales. So I said nothing. And I kept making ticks. Part 6, Poppy. The Welsh school visit was in March, a Tuesday. The school was called Ysgol Gynred Llanfair, a primary school in a village whose name I will not specify more precisely than that, because the child's parents did not consent to their daughter becoming a footnote in anyone's account of anything, and I intend to honor that even if this account exists at all. The gymnasium smelled of floor polish and old plimsolls, as I have already mentioned, which is the smell of every primary school gymnasium in Britain, regardless of county or postcode. A fact I find either reassuring or melancholy depending on the day. The children had been arranged by a well-meaning teacher who had clearly spent considerable time on the logistics, in a kind of loose semicircle on the floor, cross-legged, the way children are arranged when something official is happening, and the school wants to demonstrate that its pupils can sit in organized proximity to an important person without disgracing the institution. There were 31 of them, year 3, 7 and 8-year-olds, which is the age at which children have not yet acquired the social understanding that there are things you do not say aloud to princes. They have the vocabulary of adults and the filters of golden retrievers. William sat on a small chair facing them, too small for him. His knees were level with his chest in a way that was undignified, and he had made peace with this with the particular good humor of a very tall man who has spent his adult life in rooms and on furniture not designed for his dimensions. The press pool was small that day. 4 journalists, 2 photographers, pre-approved, briefed. I was standing to the left of the main entrance, notebook open, pen in hand. The teacher was facilitating. She invited questions. The first child, a boy named, apparently, Dylan, in a jumper that had been recently and enthusiastically cleaned, asked William if he had ever seen a real sword. Pause. 3 seconds. William said he had, and described one in the Tower of London with the precise amount of enthusiasm appropriate to the audience and the setting. Tick. The second child asked if his crown was heavy. William explained, with visible enjoyment, the distinction between a crown and a coronet and the different occasions on which each was worn, and the children's faces arranged themselves into the expression of people who have received more information than they requested, but are too polite to say so. Tick. The third child asked if he was friends with Spider-Man. Pause. The pause here was fractionally longer than usual, not because the question required political navigation, but because it required the suppression of genuine amusement, which the mechanism was not originally designed to manage. William said he had not had the pleasure, but he understood Spider-Man was very busy. Tick. The fourth child was Poppy. She was small. They are all small at 7, but Poppy was small in the particular way of children who have always been the smallest in every group and have decided, at the cellular level, to compensate through sheer volume of presence. She had red hair. She was wearing a school uniform that she had clearly dressed herself in that morning, based on the angle of the collar and the creative interpretation of what tucked in meant. She raised her hand. The teacher nodded. Poppy said, and I am reproducing this from memory, but I am confident in the accuracy, because certain sentences arrange themselves in the mind, with a permanence that has nothing to do with intention, she said. Do you ever miss your mom? The gymnasium went quiet. Not the polite quiet of adults in a formal setting managing a difficult moment. The organic quiet of 31 children who understood, instinctively and without being able to articulate why, that something had just changed in the room. The two photographers lowered their cameras approximately 2 centimeters, not all the way, but down. The teacher made a small movement, a half step forward, the beginning of an intervention, and then stopped, because William had already begun. He breathed in. He located the emotional center of the question. He determined. And then something happened that, in 34 years, I had never seen. The sequence stopped. Not failed, not produced an incorrect output. Stopped, like a clock that has been running continuously for decades and simply, between 1 second and the next, does not. He looked at Poppy. Poppy looked at him. She was waiting with the absolute patience of a 7-year-old who has asked a question she genuinely wants the answer to, and has not yet learned that some questions are not answered, only navigated. My pen was above my notebook. I did not move. 3 seconds passed. Then 4. Then 5. Then William said, no pause. Or rather, the pause had already happened and been somehow both completed and abandoned. And what came now was something that arrived without the mechanism, without the sequence, without the entry point selection, without any of the 34 years of architecture I had built around this man to keep the world from getting to exactly the place it had just gotten to. He said every single day. He said it quietly, not whispered, not performed. Quietly, in the way that things which are simply true tend to arrive when the machinery that usually processes them is not running. 2 words. Poppy nodded. She said, me too, my nan died. William said, I'm sorry. Poppy said, she had a cat, we've got the cat now. His name is Biscuit. William said, that's a good name for a cat. Poppy said, he's not very good at being a cat. William said, most cats aren't, I think. The room breathed again. The photographers had fully lowered their cameras by now. I cannot tell you whether this was instinct or professionalism or something else, but neither of them had taken a photograph during any of that exchange, and I did not think about the reasons for that until much later. My pen was still above my notebook. I looked down at the page. I did not make a tick. I closed the notebook. We drove back to London in the early evening, through the borderlands where Wales becomes England with the kind of geographic ambiguity that makes both sides feel they've won. The light was doing the thing it does in March in those hills, low and lateral and very slightly gold. And it came through the car windows at an angle that made everything inside the vehicle look briefly important. William was in the back seat. I was beside him. We did not speak for a long time. Then he said, you didn't tick. I said no. He said, should you have? I thought about that. I said no. He looked out the window. After a moment he said, she knew, didn't she, Poppy? I said she wasn't trying to, she just wanted to know. He said, that's worse. Yes, I said, it is. Another silence, long. The kind of silence that happens between two people who have worked together for 15 years and have earned the right to sit inside a quiet without filling it. Then he said, "Gerald." I said, "Sir." He said, "How many times have I done that?" Given the answer without the pause. I said, "In public, twice. Today and once in 2006 when a veteran with one arm shook your hand and you thanked him before he'd finished the gesture." He said, "That's it." I said, "That's it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the rest of the time?" It was not a question. He knew the rest of the time. He had felt it, the mechanism running, the sequence executing, the ticks accumulating. He had felt it with George on the lawn and Charlotte's drawing and Kate's question about his day. He had felt the pause where the response should have been and had assumed, I think, in the way we assume the things we have decided not to examine, that this was simply what he had become. I said, "You did what you needed to do." He said, "Did I?" I said, "Yes, and it worked, and it protected you, and the cost of it is what we'd call a secondary concern." He looked at me. He said, "Gerald, how old are you?" I said, 61. He said, "Have you ever in 34 years answered a question wrong, genuinely wrong, said something you shouldn't have to someone you shouldn't have said it to?" I thought about that for longer than I expected to. I said, "I answered a question wrong once in 1993 to my wife. She had asked me whether I was happy in the work. I said yes." He said, "Were you?" I said, "I was, and I wasn't." And I gave her the yes and not the both, because the both required me to open a door I didn't know how to open at that point in my life. And she died in 2011, and I still think about that particular conversation. He said nothing. We drove. After a while he said, "I'm going to call Kate when I get back." I said, "Good." He said, "And I'm going to answer her question about my day, actually answer it." I said, "Also good." He said, "She asked me last week." I paused. I said, "I know. I wasn't there, but I know." He turned to look at me. I said, "You've been pausing before answering the people who most need you not to since about 2015. I should have said something earlier." He said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because I didn't know how to say it without making it about the training. And it isn't about the training. The training is fine. The training saved you 100 times over. What it couldn't do, what no training can do, is know when to stop running." He looked out the window again. The hills were behind us now. The motorway was beginning. The landscape was becoming flat and functional and English in the particular way of the Midlands, which offers very little in the way of poetry but considerable honest acreage. He said, "Poppy." I said, "Yes." He said, 7 years old. I said, "Yes." He said, "No mechanism, no sequence, just every single day." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time after that. I put my notebook in my jacket pocket. I did not take it out again for the rest of the journey. Epilogue: What Gerald Fenn Believes. I retired 14 months ago. The leaving was quiet, as these things tend to be: a letter, a small gathering, handshakes from people who had been colleagues for 2 decades, and who I will likely not see again except at funerals, which is the nature of professional intimacy in institutions where discretion is both the job and the social currency. William said something to me at the gathering. I won't reproduce it here, not because it was sensitive, but because it was private, and there is a distinction between the two that I have spent 34 years insisting on, and am not about to abandon on the last page of an account I've been ambivalent about writing from the start. What I will tell you is this. The pause is real and it is necessary, and if you are a public person navigating a world that wants to use your mouth against you, you need it. This is not cynicism. This is the plain operational truth of living a visible life in an environment of structural adversarial attention. The pause is the thing between you and the trap. The pause has saved careers and preserved dignities, and kept certain truths safely inside the people they belonged to, where they could be processed in private at the appropriate time, rather than extracted in public for the entertainment of people who had no right to them. But a 7-year-old girl in a primary school gymnasium in South Wales asked a man a simple question, and the man answered it. 2 words, 11 seconds total, including Poppy's response about her nan. No mechanism, no sequence, no entry point selection, no tick. Just the true thing, arriving without infrastructure. And what I have been thinking about in the 14 months since I retired, in the flat in Pimlico that is very quiet in the evenings and has a window that faces west and catches the last 20 minutes of light in a way I did not appreciate when I was too busy to sit still. What I have been thinking about is this. The pause protects you from the world, but the world is not always the enemy. Sometimes the world is a 7-year-old asking if you miss your mom. And the only correct answer to that question is the one that arrives before the mechanism does. I taught a man to pause. He taught me in the back of a car on the way back from Wales in March, in a silence I did not fill, that there is a cost to teaching someone to pause. I have been reckoning with that cost ever since. His name, if you need reminding, is William. And every single day, I think about the tick I didn't make.